Welcome back to the history of rock music with Amy and Karl. This is episode 5, and we are looking at the decade of the 80s. For this episode, I've listened to the GoGos and Motley Crue. If you haven't watched those first listens, check them out here first, because this will make a whole lot more sense if you're following every step of my journey. And if you remember, I had some really interesting experiences listening to those two pieces for the first time, and I had some questions, and I had all kinds of things I was noticing. So here I am with Karl, and I'm ready to dive in and hear all about it.
I have to say that I'm more excited now than I've ever been in the story so far of rock music.
Okay.
I'm a huge fan of 1980s music. There are a lot of people out there who think it was the dead zone for music. I think the complete opposite.
Okay.
Oh my God, the bands that started to come out in the 1980s and the technological advances we had, it can't be overstated. This was driven by things like microcomputers and how we could actually interface as musicians and the flexibility and freedom that it gave us. I'm going to get more into that as we go through this actual presentation. But there is some general societal and political things that we have to understand about the 1980s. The 1980s was a very strong period of optimism. In the 1970s, what had happened was we had gas shortages. There was the problems in Iran where you had all of the hostages, which, just for the record, the Canadians are the ones who got the people out. But anyway, I will leave
Canadians.
that. Yes, I will leave that on the side. But it was a very turbulent period in the 70s. You'd come out of the 60s with the civil rights, women's liberation, and all of these things, and things were still very much in a non-settled situation. Coming into the 1980s, we had come out of bad economic situations, and things were starting to grow, and there was a feeling of optimism. Ironically, Ronald Reagan was put into office, who had an all-out war against the poor. And so there was this strange political dichotomy between what was going on politically and what was going on socially within the world. We came into contact with AIDS for the first time, which decimated and caused untold misery for our brothers and sisters in the LGBT community. So there was this strange dichotomy of good and bad going on, but there was this strange sense of optimism moving forward. And for those of you who want to see more about that, you can always watch the movie Boogie Nights, it's called, and you'll see this idea of optimism moving forward. This is when we also had the advent of the microcomputer and computers being used at home. And the computer was revolutionary on a whole number of levels.
Yes.
Particularly for musicians. Macintosh was leading the way with artistic software and how we could do business. But Windows, they were coming along, and even the basic Windows machines were providing us interfaces that we'd never seen before, which then allowed the artists to be more free and more creative on what they were actually getting up to. Right. It doesn't mean that the previous musicians weren't creative. Yes, they were, but they were limited in what they could do. I was telling you about Ringo Starr and how that they cut pieces out to move them around in a song. Well, you didn't have to do that. Now you can do it on a screen and just move things around. So things started to develop very quickly. And as you listen to Our Lips Are Sealed, one of the songs in the early part of the decade, you start to see this coming into play where you've got a lot more layering.
Yes, I heard it in the song.
Yes.
It was a lot more
dense.
Color and tonal variety and stacking of different sounds and parts and
Yeah, and I see it as a density. It was you're starting to get into very dense music where it was very full, and just the sound was better because they were now starting to move towards digital recording.
I see.
Well, digital recordings, nothing against analog, and there are people who argue for analog because they say the sound is warmer and stuff. Yes, but you get a lot of distortion in analog recordings, whereas digital, not only are you getting a very clear, crisp sound, which some people don't like, but it's also easy to copy it because you can make an exact digital copy of something, whereas analog, it's much more challenging to do that because you're introducing more distortion. And every time you copy it, you're introducing more distortion until it becomes unplayable, really. So this is what was going on technologically speaking. In addition to that, and I want to touch on this before I get into the songs, musical instruments started to develop rapidly in the 80s. And I know because I bought my first high quality drum set in the 1980s.
Okay.
And the quality of it compared to what I'd been using before, and I was using good quality instruments from before. Oh my God, it went through the roof.
Interesting. I'm just thinking because as a pianist, we look back to the 20s and 30s as the golden age of the best pianos,
Right.
or harps. Well, they're producing some incredible harps, but still, we look back some decades to find the harps that have a certain kind of sound, but
Sure.
and other instruments too. Well, of course, if you go to violins, you're looking all the way back to centuries ago.
Yes, yes.
And some of those violins are still in use today
Yeah.
because they have a very special sound. So it's interesting that you're saying that the quality of drums has improved so much.
It has. Now there'll
I
be
can understand something like an electrical guitar where it's kind of technology based.
sure.
But drums? Okay.
Yeah, and you'll get a lot of arguments. Like there are people who turn around, and for those who are drummers out there, three of the big companies in the 1960s was Gretsch, Ludwig, and Rogers.
Okay.
They were big companies. You also had other companies like Premier and other companies that were making drums. And they were fine instruments. Don't get me wrong, anybody. They were fine instruments. But come into the 1980s, you now had bearing edges, which is the edge on your drum where the drum head sits,
Okay.
with tolerances of thousandths of inches because you now had automated processes to make them.
Okay,
I'm
that
sorry,
makes sense.
humans can make great stuff, but when you're making an entire drum kit and it's got to be within, 1/200,000th of an inch, a human being can't pull that off. But a computer can. So the consistency started to get to better. The materials we were using for drum heads, you weren't using calf drum heads anymore, where you had to stretch them and they were affected by humidity and weather. Now you had something called mylar, which is a kind of plastic,
Right.
which you could use. So you were getting more consistent sounds. And I remember when I was a kid, to buy a set of drumsticks, I probably had 3 choices. By the 1980s, I now had 30 choices. So
Okay.
the tools were all improving
right.
during this period. Now, one of the big things that really started to come into use, and Vlad, I'm going to need you to look in closely at this instrument here. This is a standard Les Paul guitar. This is Zakk Wylde's signature guitar. Now, if we focus our attention down on this bottom area here, this is called the bridge of the guitar. And this is called a fixed bridge. It means it doesn't move. It stays in one place. So I can do all kinds of things that I would naturally do on a guitar with it. But there are certain limitations to what I can do with this in certain styles of music. It doesn't mean it's not perfectly acceptable for 99% of the music you're going to listen to. But at that time period, we started to see the introduction of the Floyd Rose. There were things that were predecessors to that. But we started to see something called a floating bridge. So let me show you a guitar with a floating bridge. Here's a guitar. This is an ESP guitar. This is a Kirk Hammett signature guitar. Kirk Hammett plays with the band Metallica. And this one, if we look, has a very different style bridge on it. It's no longer fixed in one place. And if we look at it from the side, so now we can see when I move what's called the whammy bar, the bridge can go up and down. And believe it or not, this section here is floating. The strings are holding it in place, and there are springs hidden in the back of the guitar under here, which are pulling it in the other direction. So once you get to a certain point, the force of the strings pulling it up match those of the ones underneath, and that allows it to actually float in place.
What does that do to the tuning process?
We have our standard tuners, which are up here, and those are like the guitar I was just showing you, the Les Paul. We also have micro tuners down here, like a violin, where I can turn these and do minor adjustments to it. Now you might say, well, why do you have tuners at both ends? And this is another area where this becomes an interesting instrument. At the top here, we have something called a nut.
Yes.
This nut is what we call a locking nut. There's 3 bolts in there, and I can take an Allen key and lock the strings into place. So it doesn't matter if I try and tune it up here, they will lock in place.
Right.
They run down to the bridge and they're locked in place. So one of the challenges you have with the Les Paul, our fine guitar here, is that if I start to bend the strings or pull the strings too much, this doesn't have a locking nut on it. And so the strings can go out of tune quite readily. Once you lock them into place with what's called the Floyd Rose floating bridge here, this is locked. So when I do bends down here with my bar, they stay in tune.
So it still actually doesn't go too far out of tune.
No, it keeps it in tune. Now there's also things called pinched harmonics and squeals that you can do using this bridge, which you can't do on a fixed bridge.
I see.
Which comes to play in heavy metal music.
Okay.
A lot. And in the Motley Crue song that you were listening to, Dr. Feelgood, Mick Mars, their guitarist, is using a floating bridge, and so he's getting all these wow, 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 wow sounds, and then
I see, right.
just unusual sounds that hadn't been heard before.
Okay.
Not by Motley Crue, but by people who were using the Floyd Rose system or a floating bridge system. So all of these technologies are all starting to come together at hyper velocities, giving musicians flexibility and new creative ways to...
A new frontier to explore.
Exactly, and it was wide open. There's a lot of things that you could do now that you were never able to do prior. And that was going on not only with the guitar, but with the drums, because electronic drums were now starting to come into play.
Right.
As you saw from Tice, synthesizers were really starting to come into their own and being flexible for the average user, not a specialist. So now a normal musician, which may not have a technical degree, can turn around and press the button, and now the keyboard sounds like a saxophone.
Hi, this is Graham. And just to expand a little bit on what Karl was talking about a floating bridge, I'm going to give you a quick demonstration as well as an overview on a guitar so that you can have a bit of a better perspective on what he was referring to. So on this particular guitar, I have a floating bridge. And really what that means is that the bridge itself, which is where the strings are affixed on the body of the guitar, is actually held in place, kind of floating in the air. Now, it's a little hard to see that from the front of the guitar, but if we look at the back, you'll see that the guitar has actually been carved out with quite a lot of space around the back of the bridge, and it's also held in place with a number of springs. The reason it has the springs is so that it actually has some tension in two directions, one from the string side and the other from the springs, so that it holds it in one place. Now, what we also have, and if you've ever seen a lot of different iconic guitars, is we have a whammy bar that's actually mounted to the bridge itself. And this allows you to move the bridge as it pivots on two posts, usually two posts, although there are some variations. And this allows you to change the tension on the strings. So if I push the bar down towards the body, the tension on the strings goes down, and as I pull up on the bar, the tension goes up. Now, using this bridge, we actually have a number of different techniques that we can achieve on the guitar. Everything from very subtle vibrato-like techniques, sometimes used on individual notes or maybe even on full chords. But we can also have a lot more extreme techniques that we use. Probably the most well-known is the dive bomb. Now, I'm going to be demonstrating these in a moment. There was another technique that Karl mentioned for the guitar, and this was specifically the pinch harmonic. And the pinch harmonic is a technique where the guitar player will simultaneously pluck the string using usually a pick, but they'll also kind of glance the thumb or another kind of fleshy part of the hand on the string, producing a higher pitched harmonic. So even though the original note is quite a bit lower, the resulting note is quite high. So I'll do a quick demonstration of this just so you can get a sense of what this sounds like. This is what the note would typically be without the harmonic. Okay, when I add in the pinch harmonic, you'll hear that the sound of the note is quite a bit higher. There are actually a variety of ways or a variety of notes that can be produced depending on where this technique is applied to the string. And that, of course, is left to the player or the particular piece that's getting played. So let's go back to the bridge system, the floating tremolo bridge system. I want to actually play an excerpt from a fairly well-known piece to demonstrate some of these techniques that I'm talking about. This is the entry portion of the solo from Limelight, which is, of course, by the band Rush. Okay, you'll note, again, a combination of the pinch harmonic I just talked about, as well as a very deep scoop and lift motion on the tremolo bar leading into the rest of the phrase. I want to demonstrate one last technique, and this is, of course, the one I mentioned previously, which is the dive bomb technique. In this technique, essentially what we do is we take a starting note, and then we completely slacken the strings on the guitar, resulting in this diving, again, kind of like an airplane diving to bomb, hence the name dive bomb, type of sound. Okay, I hope this helps to understand a little bit about the tremolo system, the floating bridge on a guitar. Throughout rock music, you're going to hear all sorts of techniques like this getting used quite often in lead guitar and different solos, but they can even be used within other parts of the piece as well. Take care.
When it comes to 1980s music, as you heard from the Knack with My Sharona, we were starting to get now into music that was from the 60s, its influence on music of the late 70s,
Right.
and now we were going into the 80s with all these technological changes. This melded together to make something called New Wave, which is now bringing in synthesizers, electronic drums, guitars that can make strange sounds and synthesis through computers, which had never been done before, but with this new wave sound. So what it did is you could end up with a 1960s or a 1950s sound, but now it sounds huge.
Right.
The last thing I want to talk about before I move on, because of the heavy metal element here, is something called compression.
Okay.
Now, you and I both know, but I want to explain to your audience so that your audience is well aware. In music, we use something called compression. Now, there's something called dynamic range. And as you know, dynamic range is a range between the quietest note of a song and the highest
Right.
note of a song. And that difference between those two positions ends up being your dynamic range. So as we've discussed before, Ravel's Bolero starts out at a whisper. And by the time it gets to the end, they're pumping out 120
Just
decibels.
massive.
It's massive, over the top. That has a very large dynamic range. Well, this causes problems for we as musicians in the rock genre, as Graham explained to you, with things like feedback and things that happen
Right.
because of the sheer volume of the instruments we're playing. So we started to put something into play called compression. So let's say that you have, and I'll just use these as general terms. We have something playing at 0, and we have something playing at 100. If I compress that signal, I can start pulling them down together. So now instead of being 0 to 100, it's now 10 to 90.
I see. Yeah.
So the loudest sound is a little bit quieter, but the quietest sound's a little bit louder. And I can keep squashing that whole thing down until it could be 50 and 60. So the sound is really compressed. Once I've got it there, I can then move that up in volume so that I've got this compressed sound, but it's really loud. And this is going to come up, and we're going to discuss this, especially in the 1990s, because it was very important. But it also helped us in the 1980s to get these incredibly lush sounds, because you're crashing and squishing everything together dynamically.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And that's
yeah.
called a compression and a compressor. It also comes up into play, and Mick Mars on Dr. Feelgood, he was doing some hammer-on and tap-ons. Well, when you play a note with a pick, it'll make a certain volume.
Right.
When I hit it with the tip of my finger, which is soft,
It's very small
yeah,
on an unamplified instrument or
It is.
acoustic instrument. It's,
and on acoustic instruments, it's almost next to impossible to get anything out of it. But if I compress it, Now that little quiet sound is boosted to this huge sound. So now they start to sound the same. So when I'm going, so all I have to do is just keep tapping really quickly, and all of a sudden I've got this massive sound. Okay? So these are the technical elements. And I'm explaining that because, especially before we get into the Motley Crue one, it's important to understand that those things are at play. So let's go to the Go-Go's and Our Lips Are Sealed. I was 16 or 17 when that song came out, and I fell in love with Belinda Carlisle, the lead vocalist, and Jane Wheatland, the backup vocalist, because I was a young guy, and it's like, oh my God, they're musicians. They write their own music, which was not common, not for a female band. Yeah, this was something new. They were writing all their own music. I liked the sound of the music. And of course, the girls, oh, just awesome. So for a young teenage male, they were very appealing. But of course, they also appealed to the female, which is important. Because especially in rock music, women are often subjugated to the edges of it's a guy's thing. No, it's not. But that's the way it was looked at leading up to this time period. And finally, you had a band. And incidentally, they're the largest selling female band in history. You had this band that came out writing their own music and doing what the guys do and doing it better than a lot of the guys.
So when it's my first female band listening to, and you're saying they wrote their own music, how many other female bands were there?
Thousands.
Thousands.
Yeah, there are thousands. Going right back like to the Ronettes, which is an older black female band, Diana Ross and the Supremes. There's a history of them. But a lot of them, the music was being written for them. They were being heavily produced in that because of the time period and the conservative nature, they had to dress a certain way. They had to act a certain way. Whereas now you got girls, and as you saw, so everyone knows, we watched the video after after Amy had a chance to actually go through and listen to it. Here they are dancing around in a fountain. That wouldn't have been acceptable back in earlier years. So again, as I said, the social mores and changes going from women's lib and saying no, women have a right.
Suddenly they were also not only able to be free and independent in how they shaped their sound in their band, but they also, because of that, they were able to influence what was going on around. Yes. Whereas the others were more influenced by and controlled by the musical scene around them.
Which was men.
Right.
They were controlled by men. And this was such a liberating thing, is to see that, no, women are finally getting their say. And later on, we're going to be looking at bands like the Bangles, for instance, who were following in the Go-Go's footsteps. And it opened up a whole new world for us. Sonically, also by gender. And to me, that was a very, very, very positive thing. Even though Gina Schock was not the prettiest girl in the band. Sorry if Gina Schock ever watches this. I don't mean that negatively, because she's still a beautiful woman. But she was a drummer. I just thought that was the end all and be all. Let me date that lady. Hey, she's a drummer. So yeah, it was very much a different thing. Now,
that's cool.
To give you an idea of just the impact that the Go-Go's had, on the top Rolling Stone, and I'm not a huge fan of Rolling Stone, but they do have a significant impact on music. They rated the Go-Go's Our Lips Are Sealed as number 57 out of the top 100 pop songs ever written.
Wow.
Then they came up and said that they were number 477 of the top 500 songs of all time. So you've got very little impact and input by female bands doing their original music, and then all of a sudden this band comes along and wham, they showed us that no, we're here and we want to be heard. And that's exactly what they did. Their music was used, of course, in the early 80s in the new wave genre, which was new, fresh, and exciting. And that's what helped to push along the sound that we were looking for, this multi-layered, multi-vocal, timbral kind of music, which then pushed us forward heavily into the new wave era, which we will get more into later. Okay? So that's the Go-Go's.
All right. Yeah. And I have to say I enjoyed listening to that piece of music because it was utterly interesting to me and not unpleasant. You
No,
know,
yeah.
it was very attractive and appealing in the way it was put together. So I think it's pretty cool. If that's the first significant female band that's really producing their own, even from my limited understanding, I think they did a fine job.
So do I, and it was refreshing to see that
Yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah.
Now, eventually, two of the members in particular, Belinda Carlisle, who was the lead vocalist, and Jane Weedland, who was the backup vocalist for it, they ended up having their own careers. And Belinda put out her own
Okay.
albums with great music on it. Jane Weedland did the same thing. She put out a song called Rush Hour, which I really, really enjoyed. So it was nice to see that people of this gender were finally getting their say in
Right,
how
right.
things went. And I personally really like that. Now, it brings up one final point that I want to talk about the Go-Go's before we move to Motley Crue, and that's they became famous. In 2021, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Okay.
In 2022, they're going on tour again. Bravo, girls!
Cool.
But during all of that period, I believe it was 2016, Gina Shock, the drummer, who, just as a point of interest, had quadruple bypass surgery on her heart while she was playing with the band, she sued the band because of rights for the music. She felt that she was not getting her fair
I see.
part of the money. We will talk about that in future lessons. I don't want to get bogged
Okay.
down in that right now because that is a long and very dark history to it as well. But again, we will talk about that later. So let's go on to Motley Crue.
Yes, that's great.
Motley Crue falls under something called hair metal, also known as glam metal. And a lot of the heavy metalers, especially the hardcore guys, and I can't say as I'm hardcore, but I'm very much into the technical metal side of the house. They were written off by many metalheads. Oh, these guys, you can't take them serious. Look, they're dressing in spandex. They look like girls when they play, and they did. They wore makeup.
Yeah, you showed me the pictures of them.
Yeah.
So it was just an appearance thing that
Yes.
made them get written off?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Now, the music itself was technically challenging, but not like the hardcore metal, which is even more technically challenged.
Yeah.
So the extreme people wrote them off because of it. The girls went wild over them, and I would have loved to have gone to a Motley Crue concert back in the 1980s. Oh my God, the big hair and everything. Oh, I just love that look, but I'm old, I get it. But anyway,
I think it's hilarious.
yeah, it's just something I love. But again, I guess it's because that's what I was raised around. Yeah, the teased hair. I just love it. But anyways, I digress. But it also talks about the social norms of the day, and that I love that because that's what I saw around me all the time. Now, Motley Crue is an interesting bunch. They are the epitome of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. We're going to get more into this later, but the band used to snort ants. They used to hang out with Ozzy Osbourne and do the craziest stuff. They were one of the bands that would be likely to throw the TVs out the window, have 30 different partners in a single evening, be so wasted that when they get up at 12 o'clock the following day, they don't know where they are. This was the band.
Okay.
They also made motorcycle riding for rock guys a popular thing as well, and they used those in the videos that they were showing.
I see.
Now, that has to come into play with Motley Crue right now, even though it also affected the Go-Go's, and that was video. So as we talked about Bill Haley and the Comets and all the rest with radio, and then we went to 45s, now you had video.
Now we have visuals, not just...
Not just the audio.
Yeah.
This had a massive impact in that now it was important of how you looked. There was an image that you had to have.
I see.
There's a famous story of a gentleman by the name of Christopher Cross, who wrote a song. He wrote a few songs, but he became quite famous. But when people saw what he looked like, it actually helped to end his career because he didn't have the look that people wanted him to have.
Yeah.
Now, Motley Crue, again, took it to the extreme. And yeah, they were exciting. When you and I, after you did your initial listen to the song,
Yeah.
we watched the video
We
of
did, yeah.
Dr. Feelgood, and you saw, oh my God, they're wrecking drum sets, they're blowing them up, they're doing all kinds of wild things. This was the 1980s. It was the time of free drugs, free love, and all these other things. Because even as I mentioned about AIDS wasn't that well known in the early stages, and so lots of people were having lots of sex with lots of partners. And this influenced the music. The music was brash, it was in your face. And when I look at a band like Motley Crue, who incidentally, I really like their music a lot, it was like being punched in the face. You had all this compression, you had huge recording studios doing multiple tracks of guitars being played, and another element came into it, and that was the producer. And the producer of Motley Crue was a gentleman by the name of Bob Rock. He's a Canadian who's produced a lot of the really big bands. Metallica is one that comes to mind.
Okay.
And so Bob Rock really knew the industry, and he knew how to produce heavy metal bands. And Motley Crue used them for this particular album. And as
So just
go ahead.
before I forget to ask this question,
Sure.
because it's coming back to me now as you're talking. When I did my first listen, I was struck by how dominant the instrumentation was in relationship to the vocals.
Yes.
And now you've talked about compression and all of that, and then you're mentioning the producer, and I know all of that probably has something to contribute to the whole end product.
Yes.
But is it simply a side effect of all this that was happening, or was it really consciously chosen to have the vocals so diminished in comparison to the instrumentation?
In that style of music, I would say it was a conscious decision.
And why?
Because some singers are better than others.
Okay, so you have vocals, but you don't want them to be so noticeable?
No, the other instruments started to take on a higher predominant role, as you've already identified. The drums in particular.
Yeah.
Because again, we're getting into this tribal feel, this rhythm, this groove. So when you listen to the opening of Dr. Feelgood, ching, 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 the weight of that.
Yeah,
You've got the
it's
guitar
impressive.
grinding the bass, and the bass drum is just kicking it hard.
Yeah. It's very impactful.
Do I want to take away from that from the with the vocals? No, not at all. I want to keep that driving force moving forward, because heavy metal music, and the glam metal scene is part of the heavy metal genre, it's all about energy. It's making your audience so full of energy that they can release their aggression in a positive way.
Interesting.
The fist pumping in the air. And as we've discussed before, going to a rock concert with a band like Iron Maiden or Motley Crue or any of these heavy metal bands, you're going to see a release of testosterone and energy like you've never seen before, but it's not done violently. It's done in a positive way through the music. So because of that, the instrumentation, you want to drive that information fully out there. Now, even with the vocals from Vince Neil, very high-pitched vocals compared to the crooners and other singers from before. And you will find that it's a continual theme from about the mid-70s. It did happen earlier with bands like Yes and Led Zeppelin. But this really started to become a popular style of singing, this high-pitched music, or high-pitched vocals in music. Def Leppard is a famous example of that. Rush, of course, is a famous example of that. Another band, Triumph, who you're going to be introduced to in time, and you're going to start to see that, geez, these guys sing really high. And it was that piercing, even though it's a little bit farther back in the mix, it still will pierce through what's going on.
It does cut through. It's just not as powerful as I might have expected hearing such powerful instrumentation.
Totally.
But it's probably my classical background where I expect, when I hear a powerful part of the music coming, and it includes voice, I expect the voice to match that power.
Right.
Or to add to that power. But here it feels like that's not what the voice is trying to do.
Right.
It's like the instruments are completely responsible for the power.
Right.
And the voice is something different. But I haven't quite figured out what that voice, something different for that voice is. Piercing, yes. You can hear it, yes. But it feels a little dwarfed to me.
Well, and the other thing is the voice is now almost an accompanying instrument, which is going to come up especially in
Which is funny.
the real
You're right.
hardcore
It
heavy
is,
metal.
It feels like it ought to be accompanying, but at the same time, it's doing something that is not, from my perspective, accompaniment style.
Right.
So it's just a strange, different approach to the use of the voice that I'm just not used to yet, obviously.
Certainly.
But I find it fascinating, and I'm curious to see how I relate to it as I get more familiar. But
Yep.
but it's just one of those things that it stands out to me very strongly right now.
Right, and that's with that particular piece of music in that genre. Because this is so wide,
Right, of
I could
course.
play you another piece from 1989. It's going to be totally the opposite. So it depends
I
on what
understand,
they
yeah.
were after. But having been a producer myself, I produced 2 albums now. And I've also been involved in production for other albums. I've also done engineering as far as recording. I've also done mixing and all kinds of other things. There are certain things that we go after when we're doing the mix, like on the drum set. If it's a hard driving song, the bass drum, I'm going to be pushing that up because I want it to kick through everything else so that people can hear it, because you want that thump in the chest.
I see.
You want to make the person
Yeah.
feel alive. Now, let's go to classical music just for a moment. Wagner.
Yes.
Wagner, now you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Wagner used to use huge, I've been told, 400-piece orchestras.
Massive. Unbelievably
Why did he
massive.
do that? And that's rhetorical, but I would assume, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, it was to get enough volume which suited the music, but also conveyed this energy of the music he was trying to put out there. Go
Yes,
ahead.
because obviously this is before the age of amplification and all the technology. So the only way for him to get, I guess we could say, the impact of rock, volume-wise,
Yep.
was to add instrument after instrument after instrument.
Certainly.
And just get this mass of sound. But even there, when you listen to his music that requires voice,
Yep.
that's why singing, let's say the ring cycle,
Yep.
is such a career-defining project for any singer. And they can spend a long time building up their technique and their endurance to be able to perform the cycle. And I have known of some of the best, most outstanding, powerful operatic voices who started that project and then said, I need to stop because I can feel that this is going to ruin my voice.
Right.
Because it is a huge, taxing project. Because again, it's the sound, and we're approaching it from a non-amplification tradition of creating sound, where the human voice, and that's why, if you're not into opera much, I understand, it's okay. That's why opera sounds kind of weird to a lot of people. They're like, well, it sounds like they're screaming, it sounds like they're wailing, and I can't stand. It's a technique that was developed specifically for volume.
Sure.
Volume that could be sustained through an entire vocal career.
Right.
And it takes adjusting your ear to it, and I'll be one of the first to admit that I don't listen to a ton of opera because it's not my favorite style of singing. There are some beautiful moments in opera.
Certainly.
Beautiful, but I'm not the type of person to sit down and say, oh, I just want to listen to a whole opera.
Right.
Or even an hour of opera.
Sure.
That's not me. But it was, I suppose, Wagner, you could say, would be perhaps your rock musician of yesteryear
I would totally agree.
terms of the impact of the sound that he was trying to create.
I agree with you, and I've often said that Wagner was the first heavy metal artist. From what I've listened to what he's done, I would speculate that if Wagner were alive today, he would be in a heavy metal band cranking this stuff up at massive volumes.
He might be.
Yeah, he might be. And again, that's obviously speculation.
Yeah.
But the modern day Motley Crues and Guns N' Roses and bands like this, they were trying to disrupt what was there. They wanted to say, look, yeah, this is all the contemporary music of the day, the new wave and all that. No, we want to be heard, and we're going to show you how this is really done. Now, as I said, and we will get more into this later, the other heavy metalers out there, one of the terms for glam metal and hair metal is also wimp metal, because they didn't have the technical abilities that some of the guys in the harder core heavy metal were doing.
Right.
It doesn't mean that their music wasn't great. As I said, I love a lot of the songs Motley Crue did. It was just different. It was geared to a different target, and it was geared to a target to make money, to attract girls, and so they could use drugs and have a life that was so extreme that if it didn't kill them, if nothing else, they would leave a lasting legacy. And they have. You can still hear Motley Crue on the radio all the time. In fact, they've still toured recently. In fact, I was on their website today, and it looks as though they're doing another tour. So
Interesting.
you don't have to, but I think they deserve respect, even if I don't like what they do, for producing this kind of music and providing it to the world.
Yeah.
And to me, Dr. Feelgood is one of my favorite songs of theirs. It's just got that weight to it.
It does. It does have a feeling of weight.
Which, if you think back to when you were listening to Black Sabbath and you were listening to King Diamond, it wasn't weighted like this. Yes, it was weighted for its
dark.
time. Yeah.
It was dark and it was intense musically, but instrumentally it was very sparse.
Yes.
Very bare bones.
Whereas now, there's no room to breathe in the music. There's so much going on. And it's normally very heavy in weight. Just boom, ba-dun, dun, dun, dun. But at the same time, there's this air to it. The vocals, which is why I think many heavy metal groups, because of the weight of the song, having a vocalist who has a high-pitched voice can be very beneficial, because you get now the dichotomy.
A little bit of breathing room there.
You do. You can now lay down that weight, like I was mentioning on our earlier video, where I was talking about how the drummer's laying down the foundation.
Yeah,
Everyone is starting to pile on. And on top of this is the vocalist who's got soaring vocals over top of everything. Like,
that makes sense.
What a great frequency range.
Right.
Because if you want this, and this is going to come up later, wall of sound.
Yeah.
You want to be hitting all the frequencies, and you want to give them power, which again, you were talking about. Well, why are the vocals set back a little bit? Because you want a wall. You don't want a staggered wall where some things are louder than others. No, you want it as a unified force so that when you're hit with it, it blows you off your seat.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, I can relate to that. I can understand that.
So we've gone through the 80s with a new wave song by an all-girl band who was one of the great bands in rock history. And then we've come up to this wild man stuff. And very shortly, we're going to now be moving into something different yet again. But it's all connected with one another. And that's what makes it so beautiful, is as we add videos and music for you to listen to, the connections are going to continue to build.
They're coming in here.
And all of a sudden, you're going to understand all this and go, yeah, I know what a hair metal band sounds like as soon as I hear it. I know what that is. And that's what's so exciting for me, and I hope that's what's so exciting for you.
Yeah.
Enough said from me. Thank you.
All right. So the next thing coming up is the decade of the 90s, and I will be doing a couple first listens to some songs that Karl is going to tell me what they ought to be. And then in about a week or so, you will get to see our next sit-down episode together where we talk about what took place in the 90s, and I am looking forward to it. I hope you are too. I'll see you soon.